Hi everyone, welcome back to Diamond Dave's Billiards. Today we're going to look at a shot that is more commonly used in snooker than in pool, but still has a lot of uses on the pool table, the drag shot. So by the end of this video, you'll have a good understanding of what the drag shot is, how you can use it, some practice drills to help you take it into your match, and at the end we'll have a few bonus tips and tricks. So sit back, grab a cup of tea or coffee, and whether you're a new player or an experienced player, hopefully I can show you a few tips and tricks about the drag shot. But first of all, we need to understand exactly what it is. Before we get into the details of the drag shot, let's make sure we understand exactly how spin is applied to the cue ball, whether it be from our cue or whether it just be from the friction of the cloth grabbing the ball as it moves forward. Normally when we hit low on the cue ball, our aim is to make sure the cue ball is still spinning when it hits the object ball. And what happens there is the cue ball is spinning backwards, it hits the object ball, it loses all its forward momentum, but it continues to spin backward, gripping the cloth and pulling the cue ball back. We call this a draw shot or a screw shot. If we adjust our tip position or the power with which we play the shot, we can play it in such a way that rather than spinning backwards when it hits the object ball, the cue ball is sliding. We call this a stop shot or a stun shot. The cue ball loses all its forward momentum, and with no spin on the cue ball, it simply stops. Now, on the other end of the spectrum is the cue ball's natural tendency to grip the cloth as it moves forward, creating a slight forward momentum in the cue ball. The cue ball hits the object ball and simply rolls forward slightly. That natural forward momentum and the grip of the cloth on the cue ball creates a slight forward roll. And we can exaggerate that forward momentum by hitting the very top of the cue ball, causing the cue ball to spin forward. Now, this time when it hits the object ball, it loses that forward momentum, but the cue ball is still spinning forward. It grips the cloth and pulls the cue ball forward, and we call playing this shot a shot with top spin. All the variations of this forward and back spin are controlled by where we put the tip of our cue and how much power we play the shot with. And we can change the amount of spin by varying these two variables. So, for example, if we play our cue tip 2 tips below center with 50% power, we will get a certain amount of backspin. If we play the same shot 2 tips below center but with 75% power, we will get more backspin. Or we can change the tip position to control the backspin. We can play 2 tips below center with 50% power and we'll get a certain amount of backspin. If we play 1 tip below center with 50% power, we will get less backspin. So these two variables control how much spin is on the cue ball when we play the shot. As a side note, sometimes being able to visualize that spinning action of the cue ball can make it easier to play those delicate screw shots or stop shots rather than simply thinking hit low, make cue ball come back, or hit high, make cue ball roll forward. To sum that all up, a combination of tip position and power forces the cue ball to spin in certain directions, and once it transfers all its energy into the object ball, whatever spin is remaining on the cue ball controls what the cue ball does next. Now, we can take all that information and talk about exactly what a drag shot is. We know we can make the cue ball spin backwards by hitting low on the cue ball, and we know we can change how much it spins backwards by changing our tip position or the power with which we play the shot. We also know that a cue ball naturally wants to roll forward as it moves forward across the cloth. Regardless of how much backspin or how hard we hit the cue ball, eventually that backspin will die. The cloth will grab the cue ball and it will eventually go from spinning backwards to sliding and then to rolling forward as the cloth grips the cue ball. A drag shot is played in such a way that for most of its journey towards the object ball, the cue ball is actually spinning backwards. However, just before it hits the object ball, the backspin dies on the cue ball and it's either sliding or rolling forward slightly as it hits the object ball. This means that when the cue ball does hit the object ball, it has very little forward momentum on the cue ball. Normally, if we want the cue ball to move a very short distance after it hits the object ball, we have to play the shot quite softly. In the shot I'm showing now on the screen, I want to pot 7, but I want the cue ball to stay very close to the short rail for the 8. In the first shot, I'm playing that shot with power alone. I'm simply hitting the cue ball very softly. In the second shot, I'm playing the shot as a drag shot. you can see that the cue ball starts off moving a lot quicker and it has a lot of backspin. However, by the time it hits the object ball, the same result happens. The cue ball moves a very short distance and stays close to the short rail. Now, by watching this shot carefully, you can see why it's called the drag shot. The backspin drags the pace out of the cue ball as it eventually slides and then moves into its natural forward momentum. At this point, you might be thinking, Dave, why would I want to play this really complicated shot where I have to think about tip position and power and judge all these variables in order to make the cue ball stop spinning backwards just before it hits the object ball when I could just roll the ball in really softly? Well, there's a few reasons the drag shot is useful, and some of them obvious, some of them not so obvious. So let's have a look at both the pros and the cons of having the drag shot in your pool playing arsenal. The most beneficial part of being able to play the drag shot is also the most obvious difference between it and playing a shot softly. It's the speed at which you can play the shot. Even on the best of tables, playing a long shot softly is fraught with danger. And we've seen this in some of the recent Matchroom events. Matchroom has decades of experience in cue sports, primarily with snooker. But even in some of the Matchroom events, it's extremely difficult to get a table truly level. And when we're playing in less than ideal environments, sometimes we have to deal with things like imperfections in the cloth or little bits of chalk sitting on the table. Now, the slower the cue ball is moving, the more likely it is to be affected by either a table that isn't truly level, or an imperfection in the cloth, or a stray piece of chalk. The faster the cue ball is moving, the less likely it is to be affected by any of these things. As an example, my personal table has a slight roll up away from this bottom left-hand corner pocket. If I play a shot slowly towards this pocket, I have to take that into consideration. However, I can avoid that roll by playing the shot with more power. This allows me to play the shot truly and with more confidence. Another issue is that playing delicate shots under pressure can sometimes be quite difficult. When we're feeling the stress and tension of a tight match, our arm can get very tight and it's difficult to maintain control of those fine motor skills. Some people find playing shots firmly and with confidence easier under pressure situations rather than playing soft, delicate shots. Playing the drag shot in certain situations can offer a solution to both the unpredictability of a table that you don't know very well, or the pressure of a tight, tense situation. It allows you to play a firm, confident shot and yet still maintain delicate control of the cue ball rather than having to rely on the table doing exactly what you want it to do. The drag shot does have a few alternative uses and there's a few variations to it as well, but we'll look at that later on in the video. First, let's look at the risks of playing a drag shot. There are really only two caveats to playing the drag shot. One is that it doesn't come up very often in normal matches, so it does require dedicated practice. And the other one is that it will reveal any errors in your cueing. Because you're hitting low on the cue ball, if you don't hit center, the effect of that side spin on the cue ball will have quite a large impact on the path of the cue ball and what it does when it hits the object ball. The solution to the first problem is, of course, to practice, and we'll talk about that next. The second problem, which is accidentally swerving the cue ball by putting unintentional side on it, can actually be resolved in the way we play the drag shot. Well, I'll explain what I mean. It's actually quite difficult to hit center ball, just plain center ball, because there's no visual reference on the cue ball to tell us exactly where center ball is. We're relying on our eyesight, on our spatial awareness, and of our eyes seeing true center to know that we're hitting center ball. However, there is one point of reference on the cue ball, and that is where the cue ball touches the table. This is true center ball. If we start with our cue tip low on the cue ball, we can actually reference that to where the cue ball touches the table, and we know that that is true center. Now, it just so happens that when we play a drag shot, we are playing extremely low on the cue ball. So if you find that you're putting unwanted side on the cue ball, you can use that little trick. Just reference where the cue ball touches the cloth and use that to help you find true center. This is also a useful trick for finding true center even if you're not playing a drag shot. Use that reference point of where the cue ball touches the table as true center, and then adjust up and down accordingly. If you find that you're still applying side to your shots, unintentional side, that's a more technical problem that's beyond the scope of this discussion. You'll need to look deeper into why that's happening. And of course, practice is also part of the solution. And practicing the drag shot can actually be quite a good diagnostic tool for hitting center ball. As soon as you hit off center, it becomes extremely obvious because that cue ball is spinning backwards, and any left or right side will be immediately obvious to you when you play the shot. So practicing the drag shot can actually help you figure out if you're hitting true center or not. We've looked at what the drag shot offers, and we've looked at things to be careful of when playing the drag shot. Now let's have a quick look at a few practice drills to help you make the most of the shot. Practicing the drag shot is as simple as practicing any other draw shot or follow shot or stunt shot. Set yourself up a long, straight shot and set up a few marker balls on the table as well. Use these balls as reference points for playing the drag shot. You can start off by trying to make the cue ball slide just before it hits the object ball. See how slowly you can play that shot and get the cue ball to just stop next to one of the marker balls. Next, you can try to get the cue ball to roll forward 2 or 3 inches, again using a marker ball as a reference, and so on and so on. Just set up those marker balls and play the drag shot again and again, attempting to allow the cue ball to just stop or roll forward slightly so that backspin just dies before it hits the object ball. Another thing you can do while playing this drill is to vary the amount of draw and power you play the shot with, and you'll start to get a real feel for how that cue ball spins as it moves across the table. You'll understand that you don't need to pound an object ball into the pocket in order to get the cue ball to stop in place. You'll get a feel for those delicate screw shots of how the cue ball is spinning backwards, of how it begins to slide as it moves across the table. And you'll learn that there are various advantages to being able to play a stop shot softly. For example, how much the cue ball moves on the tangent line after it hits the object ball. This feel for the action of the cue ball will also transfer into other parts of your game. For example, it will benefit your draw shot. You'll begin to understand how you don't need to power shots in to get a lot of action on the cue ball. You'll understand when that action dies on the cue ball. Playing those fast little nip draw shots will become easier as you experiment with different lengths of backstroke and acceleration in order to control that spin of the cue ball. Playing the drag shot and practicing it will definitely add a lot of touch to your game and familiarize you with that action of the cue ball. And in fact, you might find that becoming familiar with the drag shot adds a few other tricks to your pool playing toolbox. Something the drag shot allows you to do is play shots with extreme amounts of side without hitting the object ball too hard. This is because when you play the drag shot, you hit the ball quite hard to get that backspin, but as we've seen, the backspin dies just before it hits the object ball, which slows down the cue ball. What's left on the cue ball is what other spin you've applied. After that backspin's died, there's still extreme amounts of left or right-hand side on the cue ball, and this can allow you to generate some pretty crazy angles off the cushions. Take this shot for example. If I play the shot with pure left-hand side, I can generate a lot of angle after the cue ball hits the rail, but no matter how much left-hand side I put on the cue ball, I can't get the cue ball to come underneath the 9. However, if I play the shot with extreme drag and left-hand side, the pace on the cue ball dies, and what's left is extreme amounts of left-hand side, pulling the cue ball down the rail and underneath the 9, something I couldn't do with pure left-hand side alone. Another example is playing a soft shot with a lot of check or inside English. I can play this shot firmly with lots of inside English or check without overpowering the object ball and generate huge amounts of inside spin after it hits the rail. Now, of course, these are extreme shots. They're a lot of fun to play, but they don't often come up in matches. They do sometimes, and of course, whether you can actually play them or not is dependent on the conditions you're playing in. Speaking of which, if you'd like to see a video on how various conditions affect various shots and whether those shots are even possible, let me know, because if you're not familiar with how new balls or polished balls or new cloth affect your ability to play certain shots, you can certainly get a nasty surprise. So, there you have it. the ins and outs, the uses, the benefits, the risks, and a few variations and tricks you can do while playing the drag shot. Despite all that, one of the best uses for the drag shot is actually when you have an object ball that is directly over a pocket and the cue ball is quite some distance away. You might want to play that shot very softly to hold the cue ball down here, and you don't want to worry about whether the table's going to roll off or whether there's something in the way. And playing a drag shot can really allow you to control the pace of such a simple shot without having to trust to your equipment. Next time you're in a position like this, instead of playing it softly and wondering if the cue ball's going to roll off or do something else weird, try playing a drag shot instead. As always, if this video has helped you in some way, whether that be through a little bit of extra knowledge or just entertainment, watching someone talk about a sport that you enjoy, then let me know by tapping that like button or the sub button. It really gives me the motivation to explore new ideas and do a bit of research and put out some content for the pool playing community. Okay guys, as always, get out there and enjoy playing some pool. Ciao.